My parents demanded $50,000 back rent for my childhood bedroom. I handed them the eviction notice. Now, I'm standing in my parents' kitchen, the same kitchen where I learned to ride a bike helmet on backwards, the same kitchen where my mother used to cut the crusts off my sandwiches, and I'm holding a folded piece of paper that's about to end everything as they know it. My father is laughing. Actually laughing. $50,000, he says again, like repeating it makes it less absurd. Back rent. For 18 years in that room. My mother won't look at me. She's looking at the paper in my hand like it's a snake. You want back rent, I say, for the bedroom I grew up in. You lived there for free, my father says. 18 years. Do you know what that's worth? I do, actually. I know exactly what it's worth. That's the problem. I set the folded paper on the counter between us. My mother's hands are shaking before she even opens it. Before you ask me for $50,000, I say, you should probably read this first. My father snatches it up, scanning the header, and I watch his face go through every color a face can go through, confusion, disbelief, and finally something close to fear. This is, he starts. An eviction notice, I finish. 30 days. It's all legal. My lawyer drew it up months ago. The silence in that kitchen lasted longer than any silence I'd ever lived through in that house. But before I tell you how that moment happened, how it got to the point where my own parents tried to bill me for my childhood, you need to know how it started. 'Cause none of this happened overnight. It happened over 31 years, one quiet betrayal at a time. Then, my name is Daniel. I was the oldest of two. My younger sister Reagan and I grew up in a modest two-story house in a town where everyone knew everyone's business before they knew their own. My father, Walter, worked maintenance for the county. My mother, Linda, did the books for a dentist's office downtown. We weren't rich. We weren't poor. We were the kind of family that clipped coupons but still managed birthday cakes from the good bakery. I was the responsible one. Even as a kid, I was the one setting the table without being asked, the one walking myself to school so my parents didn't have to leave work early, the one who got straight A's not because anyone pushed me but because I genuinely loved learning. I wanted to be an engineer since I was 9 years old after I took apart our toaster and somehow miraculously put it back together working better than before. My dreams were simple. Get good grades, get a scholarship, build something with my hands and my brain that mattered. I never asked my parents for much. I worked a paper route at 12, bus tables at 16, paid for my own car insurance at 17. Now, 3 hours before the kitchen scene, I'm sitting in my truck outside my old house, engine off, staring at the porch light that's been the same flickering yellow my whole life. My hands are steady on the wheel, which surprises me because everything in me feels like it should be shaking. In my glove box is the folded paper. In my head is every reason it took me 31 years to finally bring it. Then, back when I was a kid, my mother used to say something to me that I didn't understand until much later. She'd tuck me in and whisper, "You're the strong one, Danny. Strong ones don't need as much." I thought it was a compliment. It wasn't. It was a warning. Something about the way she said it, like she was preparing me for something, should have felt wrong. It didn't. Not yet. Then, the first time I noticed the difference, I was 9. Reagan, my sister, was 7. We both wanted the same bike for Christmas, a blue one with a banana seat, the kind every kid in our neighborhood was begging for. I'd been saving my allowance for 4 months. Reagan hadn't saved a cent. Christmas morning, there was one bike under the tree. Reagan's name was on the tag. "You're older," my mother said when I asked. "You understand patience better." I didn't say anything. I just nodded because that's what the strong one does. Became a pattern I didn't have a name for back then. New clothes for Reagan's school dance, hand-me-downs for mine. A car for Reagan at 16, used but a car, while I drove myself to work on a bicycle until I saved enough for my own beater at 18. When I made the honor roll, it got a mention at dinner. When Reagan made the honor roll once in 10th grade, there was a cake. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I was the strong one and strong ones don't need as much. Now, sitting in the truck, I finally open the glove box and take the paper back out just to read it one more time before I walk in. My phone buzzes. It's Reagan. Don't do this, Daniel. Please. They're still our parents. I stare at that message for a long time. She doesn't know what I know. Not yet. Then, the strange conversation happened the week after I graduated college. I just landed my first engineering job, a good one, 6 figures right out of the gate, the kind of offer that made my college advisor whistle. I called home to share the news, expecting my parents to be proud. My mother's first words were, "That's wonderful, honey. Listen, your father and I need to talk to you about something when you get a chance." About the house. I didn't think much of it at the time. I should have. Then, the conversation about the house turned out to be about my grandfather's estate. My grandfather, my mother's father, had passed 2 years earlier and left behind a modest trust. I'd always assumed it had been split evenly between my mother and her brother, my Uncle Phil, and that whatever came to our family had simply been folded into the house, into bills, into things I never saw, because that's not how parents talk to their kids about money.
What I didn't know, what I wouldn't find out for another 9 years, was that my grandfather hadn't left the money to my mother outright. He'd left a portion of it in a trust specifically for me and Reagan, to be distributed when we turned 25. My mother was the trustee. I was 25 that year. The conversation about the house was never about the house at all. Now, I walk up the porch steps. The boards still creak in the same 2 places they always have: 3rd step, 6th step. My hand is on the door before I let myself remember the rest. Then, it took me years to even learn the trust existed. The discovery started with a single envelope, addressed to me, forwarded 3 times, finally arriving at my apartment 8 years after my grandfather's death. It was from a law firm I'd never heard of, in a county I didn't recognize, asking me to confirm my identity for records related to the estate of Harold Bennett. Harold Bennett, my grandfather. I called the number on the letter, certain it was a mistake or a scam. It wasn't. The woman on the phone, a paralegal named Carol, told me there had been a trust set up in my name and my sister's name, funded at $15,000 each, meant to mature and disperse at age 25 with accumulated interest. I was 31 when I got that call. That account, Carol said carefully, shows a balance of $312. My stomach dropped through the floor of my apartment. There should be over $20,000 in there by now, she said. Can I ask who the trustee was? I already knew the answer before she finished the question. That's when everything I thought I understood about my childhood started to crack open. Then, I confronted my mother on the phone first, gently, because some part of me still hoped there was an explanation. Maybe medical bills. Maybe an emergency I didn't know about. Mom, I got a call from a lawyer about Grandpa's trust. There's barely anything left in it. What happened? There was a long pause. Then, Daniel, we used that money to raise you. Food doesn't grow on trees. That money wasn't for groceries, Mom. It was specifically left for me. By name. And we are your parents, she snapped. Everything we did for this family. You should be thanking us, not interrogating me like some kind of criminal. That was the first time she made me feel like the villain for asking a simple question. Then, it got worse at Thanksgiving that year. I made the mistake of mentioning it to my father privately, hoping he'd be more reasonable. He wasn't. You ungrateful little... he started, then caught himself, glancing toward the dining room where Reagan and her husband were laughing about something at the table. He lowered his voice. You think you had it hard? I worked 2 jobs so you could have braces. I worked so you could go to that fancy college. And now you're keeping score over $20,000. It wasn't your money, Dad. It was mine. Everything in that house was ours to manage. That's what parents do. Then in front of the whole family, loud enough for everyone to hear, he said, Daniel's upset because apparently we owe him money. Can you believe that? After everything. Reagan looked at me like I just spit on the table. My aunt shook her head slowly, muttering something about ingratitude. I sat there, humiliated in the house I grew up in, for asking what happened to money that was legally mine. Then, The gaslighting didn't stop there. Over the next year, every family gathering became an opportunity for my parents to subtly recast me as the difficult one, the entitled one, the one who couldn't let go of old grudges. My mother told relatives I was going through something. My father implied to my uncle that I'd always had issues with jealousy toward Reagan. I started to wonder if I really was the problem. That's what good manipulation does, it makes you doubt the thing you actually witnessed. But then I opened the envelope from Carol the paralegal a second time, and read the documented timeline of withdrawals my mother had made from that trust over 15 years, and I remembered. I wasn't imagining anything at all. Now, I'm standing in the entryway of my parents' house now. I can hear my mother in the kitchen, the clink of mugs being set on the counter, the low murmur of the television. I haven't walked in yet. I'm still in the hallway, looking at the photos on the wall, me at 8, me at graduation, Reagan at every milestone in between, twice as many frames for her than for me. I never noticed that as a kid. I notice it now. Then, after the Thanksgiving humiliation, I stopped reacting emotionally and started documenting. I requested the full trust records from Carol's firm. Every withdrawal, every date, every signature. I screenshotted every text message where my mother referenced borrowing from Daniel's account for the family. I saved voicemails. I kept a private folder, backed up in 3 places that grew heavier every month. I hired a lawyer. Not a divorce-style courtroom shark, but a calm, methodical estate attorney named Priya who specialized in breach of fiduciary duty. She read through everything I brought her in near silence, occasionally making a small sound that wasn't quite a sigh. "This isn't a gray area," she said finally. "Your mother had a legal obligation as trustee. She violated it repeatedly in writing for over a decade." I asked her what that meant for me. "It means," she said, "you have options most people in your situation never get." I didn't tell my parents any of this. Not yet. I just kept gathering, kept documenting, kept waiting for the right moment, because I knew somehow that they weren't finished making it worse. I was right. Then, the final insult came at my sister's wedding, 18 months later. I'd put the trust issue aside for the day, determined to be the supportive older brother Reagan deserved. I gave a toast. I meant every word of it. Then during the reception, my father stood up with a second microphone, uninvited, unannounced, and decided it was the moment to clear the air. "I just want to say," he began, swaying slightly with champagne, "that families go through ups and downs. Some of us," he looked directly at me across the room in front of 200 guests, "have a hard time being happy for other people. Some of us keep score on things that don't matter. But today isn't about that. Today's about Reagan."
The room went quiet in that specific way a room goes quiet when everyone realizes they just witnessed something cruel disguised as wisdom. I didn't say a word. I smiled, raised my glass, and let it happen because Reagan's day mattered more than my dignity. That wasn't the worst part. Then, the worst part came 2 weeks later when I learned, through Reagan, who finally cracked under the weight of her own guilt, that my parents had quietly redrafted their will the year prior. Not to disinherit me entirely. Something colder than that. They'd written in a clause stating that any inheritance I received would be reduced in proportion to financial support already provided during minority, with my childhood bedroom, my schooling, my upbringing costs itemized like a ledger against my name. They had turned my entire childhood into a debt. That's when I understood, this wasn't about money anymore. This had never been about money. It was about control, about my parents needing on some level to prove that everything I had ever received from them came with strings, and that I owed them for the basic fact of having been raised. I sat with that revelation for 3 days before I called Priya back. I think I told her it's time. Then, Priya had already anticipated this. Months earlier, while building my case around the trust violations, she'd uncovered something I hadn't known to look for. The original deed history on my grandfather's house, the same house my parents had quietly inherited after his death and later used as collateral for a second mortgage. Buried in the estate paperwork was a stipulation my grandfather had added 11 years before his death, naming me as a contingent beneficiary on a separate property, a small rental house 2 towns over, should certain trust obligations toward his grandchildren ever be left unfulfilled. My grandfather, it turned out, hadn't fully trusted his daughter with that money either. He'd built in a failsafe. Trust hadn't just been violated. It had triggered a clause my parents didn't even know existed. This changes everything, Priya told me. You're not just owed restitution from the trust. Depending on how a judge interprets this clause, you may have a legitimate claim to that second property outright. I sat in her office staring at the documents, feeling something shift in my chest, not triumph exactly. Something closer to gravity finally returning to a room that had been weightless for years. Then, took another 4 months to build the case properly. Formal demand letters, a forensic accountant's report on the trust withdrawals, and a title search on the rental property. By the time Priya was finished, we had what she called an airtight narrative. Not just evidence. A story no judge and no family member could spin their way out of. The eviction notice, the one I'd carry into that kitchen, wasn't random spite. It was strategy. The rental property the trust clause now entitled me to was the very property my parents had been planning to use as a retirement fallback, the place they intended to live once they sold the family house. They just didn't know it belonged to me yet. Then, I asked for a family meeting under the guise of discussing the holidays. Reagan came, looking nervous, clearly suspecting something but not knowing what. My parents arrived expecting an apology. They'd been telling relatives for weeks that I was finally coming around. What they didn't expect was the demand they made the moment I walked in. Before we sit down, my father said, arms crossed, your mother and I have been talking. You lived in this house 18 years rent-free. We think it's only fair, given everything else going on, that you contribute something back. $50,000 feels reasonable considering. I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I just nodded slowly. Okay, I said. Let's talk about fairness then. Now. This is the moment the two timelines finally meet. I'm back in that kitchen, the same scene from the opening, except now you know everything I knew when I walked in. The folded paper isn't a bluff. It isn't an outburst. It's the final move in a 4-year chess match my parents didn't know they were playing. My mother is staring at the eviction notice on the counter. My father's laugh from a few minutes ago has completely disappeared. What is this? My father says, voice lower now. That, I say, is an eviction notice for the rental property on Fenimore Street. The one you've been planning to retire into. Read the second paragraph. My father reads. His hand starts to shake. This says you own that property, he says. I do, I say. As of 3 weeks ago, when the court confirmed the trust clause Grandpa wrote into his estate plan. You can call your own lawyer to verify it. I have the paperwork. That's item 1. I set a second folder on the counter, this one thicker. My mother flinches at the sight of it before I even open it. Item 2, I say. This is the full accounting of Grandpa's trust, the one meant for me and Reagan. Every withdrawal. Every signature. 15 years of records. My mother's face goes pale. Daniel, we can explain. You don't have to, I say. The accountant already explained it for you. Forensic report. Independently verified. Reagan, sitting at the table, goes very still. Mom, she says quietly, is this true? My mother doesn't answer her. That's item 2's reaction, silence, the loudest kind. I pull out a third document. This is the new will you drafted 2 years ago. The one itemizing my upbringing costs against my inheritance. I slide it toward my father. You turn my childhood into a debt on paper. I have a copy. So does my lawyer. My father's jaw tightens. That was never meant to actually. It's notarized, I say. It was meant exactly the way it reads. That's item 3. His excuse dies halfway out of his mouth. I set down the fourth and final item, a single page, the demand letter Priya sent 2 weeks ago, with my parents' own attorney's signature acknowledging receipt at the bottom. This is the settlement offer my lawyer sent you. You never responded. You never told me you got it. You just kept planning to demand $50,000 from me instead, hoping I'd back down quietly like I always have. Kitchen is dead silent now. My mother is gripping the edge of the counter. My father is staring at 4 pieces of paper that have just rearranged the entire architecture of his family's future. So I say about that $50,000. My father tries one more time. Daniel, be reasonable. We're your parents. Family doesn't do this to each other. Family doesn't drain a dead man's trust meant for his grandchildren either, I say. Family doesn't stand up at a wedding and humiliate their own son in front of 200 people. Family doesn't write a will turning childhood into an invoice. My mother starts crying, not the soft kind, the kind that comes when someone realizes the version of events they've told themselves for years has just collapsed in front of witnesses. We didn't mean for it to feel like that, she says. It's not about how it felt, I say. It's about what it was. My father sits down slowly, the eviction notice still in his hand, like the weight of it is suddenly too much to hold standing up. What happens now? He asks quietly. Not angry anymore. Just hollow. Now, I say, you have 30 days on that property, same as the notice says. As for the trust, my lawyer will be in touch about repayment terms. I'm not trying to bankrupt you. I'm trying to make sure you can never pretend this didn't happen. Reagan is crying too, but for a different reason. I didn't know, she keeps saying. I swear I didn't know any of this. I know, I tell her. This was never about you. I don't yell. I don't gloat. I don't list every grievance from childhood I'd been carrying, even though I could have filled another hour doing it. Instead, I do something that surprises even me. I offer them a way to keep some dignity. I'm not doing this to destroy you, I tell my parents. I'm doing this because I spent 31 years being told that asking for fairness made me the villain. I'm done accepting that story. I tell them they have options regarding the rental property. They can negotiate a lease through my lawyer if they want to stay on fair market terms like any other tenant. I tell them the trust repayment can be structured over time, not as punishment but as accountability. This isn't revenge, I say, standing in the doorway of the house I grew up in. It's the first time I've ever set a boundary with you and meant it. My father doesn't say anything. My mother whispers, I'm sorry, for what I believe for the first time in my life might actually be sincere. I don't forgive them on the spot. I don't owe anyone a fast resolution to 31 years of imbalance. But I walk out of that house with my shoulders straighter than they've been in years. 6 months later, my parents are living in a smaller place across town, the rental property leased out under fair terms negotiated through our lawyers, civil, businesslike, finally honest. Trust repayment is structured, slow but real, landing every quarter exactly when it's supposed to. Reagan and I talk more now than we ever did growing up. She told me a few weeks after that day in the kitchen that she'd spent her whole life believing she was the favorite, only to realize being the favorite had just meant being shielded from the truth. My mother and I are speaking again, carefully, slowly, like two people relearning a language. My father and I are still finding our footing. Some wounds don't close just because the paperwork's settled. But for the first time since I was 9 years old, watching my sister ride a bike I'd saved 4 months to buy myself, I don't feel like the strong one who needs less. I just feel like someone who finally got what was fair. If you made it this far, I want to ask you something. What would you have done in that kitchen? Would you have handed over the eviction notice, or would you have walked away from the whole family years earlier? Has anyone in your life ever tried to turn your childhood into a debt you owed them? I'd love to hear your story in the comments. Sometimes the most healing thing we can do is realize we're not the only ones who've lived this.